May 1945, across Europe and the Pacific, an armored force sits silent. More than 49,000 M4 Sherman medium tanks occupy fields, depots, and motor pools from France to the Philippines. These 30-ton machines, with their 75mm guns and welded steel hulls, had carried Allied armies from North Africa to Berlin, from the bloody sands of Tarawa to Tokyo Bay. The scale defies easy comprehension. Between 1942 and 1945, 11 American factories produced 49,324 Sherman tanks, an industrial achievement that overwhelmed Axis production capacity. The Chrysler Detroit tank arsenal alone built over 18,000 tanks. Ford Motor Company produced thousands more at plants never designed for armored warfare. Fisher Body, Pressed Steel Car Company, Pacific Car and Foundry, all transformed from civilian manufacturers into the arsenal of democracy's tank builders. Now, with surrender documents signed in both theaters, a question as massive as the armored fleet itself demands answering. What does one do with nearly 50,000 tanks when the war requiring them has ended? The immediate post-war situation facing military authorities in the autumn of 1945 presented both opportunity and burden. The United States Army Ordnance Department, which had coordinated Sherman production across the continent, now controlled the world's largest armored force at the precise moment peacetime requirements demanded far less capacity. Pre-war American tank forces totaled fewer than 400 vehicles. The Sherman program alone had added more than 120 times that figure. The mathematics were inescapable. The vast majority of these vehicles had no peacetime role. Yet the condition of the fleet varied dramatically. Roughly 6,000 Sherman tanks had been destroyed in combat, victims of German 88mm guns, Japanese anti-tank mines, or mechanical failures in hostile terrain. Approximately 2,000 had been converted to specialized purposes: bulldozer tanks for clearing obstacles, recovery vehicles for battlefield salvage, flamethrower variants mounting napalm projectors instead of main guns, the curious Sherman crab mine-clearing tanks with rotating chains that detonated buried explosives. The remaining vehicles showed every stage of wear. Tanks produced in late 1944 with minimal combat hours sat alongside battered survivors of the North African campaign, their armor scarred by 3 years of desert warfare, Italian mountains, and French hedgerows. Army ordnance teams inspecting the European fleet during October and November 1945 classified vehicles into categories: those fit for continued service, those requiring major overhaul before deployment, those whose condition or obsolescence made them candidates for immediate scrapping. 4 distinct interests competed for control of this vast armored force. The American War Department sought to preserve strategic reserves against unknown future conflicts. The Treasury Department demanded liquidation to recover wartime expenditure. Foreign governments, particularly in Europe and Asia, desperately needed modern armor to rebuild their shattered militaries. Private scrap dealers recognized profit in mountains of surplus steel even at depressed post-war prices. The United States developed a multi-track approach that unfolded through 1946 and 1947. First, the immediate establishment of reserve fleets for strategic contingency. Second, extensive foreign military assistance programs distributing thousands of tanks to allied nations. Third, systematic scrapping of vehicles deemed surplus to all requirements. The execution of this plan would reshape global armored forces and determine which communities thrived on continued military production versus those facing industrial collapse. The Reserve Fleet program transformed American harbors and military installations into vast tank parks. The Army designated facilities across the continental United States for long-term vehicle storage. Tanks received preservation treatment. Engines drained of fluids, exposed metal coated with protective compounds, ammunition and fuel removed, batteries disconnected, canvas covers secured over vulnerable components. These vehicles, maintained at minimal expense, stood ready for potential reactivation if future conflict required rapid armored force expansion. The Korean War in June 1950 validated this strategy dramatically. When North Korean T-34-85 tanks crossed the 38th parallel, American forces in Japan possessed inadequate armor for immediate deployment. The occupation had prioritized demobilization over readiness. The systematic recovery and refurbishment of World War II equipment stored across Pacific Islands suddenly accelerated from leisurely disposal to emergency mobilization. The Tokyo Ordnance Depot became the focal point for this remarkable operation. Thousands of vehicles of all types passed through the facility between July 1950 and August 1950. The Sherman tanks, previously destined for scrapping or long-term storage, underwent rapid refurbishment. Engines tested and repaired, tracks replaced, guns verified. Between July 1950 and the armistice in 1953, hundreds of M4A3 E8 EZ-8 Shermans deployed to Korea. These vehicles, many stored for 5 years in tropical humidity, returned to combat facing Soviet-designed T-34-85 tanks operated by North Korean crews. The performance surprised skeptics. The M4A3 E8 Sherman and the T-34-85 proved comparable in firepower and protection. Both could destroy each other at normal combat ranges. However, American advantages in optics, ammunition quality, and crew training tilted engagements towards Sherman crews. Tanks dismissed as obscene museum pieces just months earlier provided crucial armored support through 3 years of grinding combat. The Korean War demonstrated that strategic reserve tanks, properly maintained, retained combat utility years after production ceased. Yet Korea absorbed only a fraction of available inventory. The broader distribution occurred through military assistance programs that armed dozens of nations worldwide. Britain received the largest allocation. Under Lend-Lease agreements during the war, the United Kingdom had obtained 17,181 Sherman tanks, roughly 34% of all American production. Post-war, Britain retained thousands for its own forces while redistributing others to Commonwealth nations and allied states. British Sherman tanks supported occupation duties in Germany, colonial operations in Malaya, and training exercises across the empire. The British Army operated Shermans until the late 1950s, when Centurion tanks finally replaced them in frontline service. France acquired substantial Sherman stocks for post-war reconstruction of its armored forces. These tanks equipped French units in occupation zones and colonial territories. Many French Sherman tanks later transferred to Israel, which upgraded them extensively. The Israeli Defense Forces transformed surplus Shermans into the M50 and M51 variants, mounting powerful French 75mm and 105mm guns that turned obscene American tanks into formidable weapons. Israeli Super Shermans fought successfully in the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, destroying modern Soviet tanks through superior gunnery and tactics. Some Israeli-modified Shermans remained in service until the 1980s, nearly 40 years after their original manufacture. The list of nations operating post-war Shermans reads like a UN roster. Greece received 98 Shermans between 1946 and 1948. Italy obtained hundreds for NATO service. Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway all equipped armored units with American surplus. In Asia, Japan's self-defense forces received 250 M4A3 tanks in 1954. The Philippines deployed Sherman tanks to Korea as part of its UN contingent. India purchased Shermans in the 1950s and operated them until 1971. Pakistan acquired 547 Shermans, using approximately 300 in combat during the Indo-Pakistani Wars of 1965 and 1971. South American nations received Sherman tanks through various military assistance programs. Brazil obtained 83 tanks and operated them until 1979. Chile acquired Israeli Super Shermans and developed the M60 variant, mounting a 60mm hypervelocity gun. These Chilean Shermans served until 1999, possibly the last Sherman tanks in active military service anywhere in the world. Paraguay still possessed operational Sherman tanks as of 2016, primarily for training purposes, though these were finally retired in April 2018. The geographic distribution of Sherman tanks created a secondary market in spare parts, technical expertise, and upgrade programs that sustained entire industries for decades. Nations operating Shermans required ammunition, replacement tracks, engine parts, and technical manuals. American contractors and foreign firms competed for lucrative maintenance contracts. The standardization that had enabled mass production during wartime now enabled long-term support across global markets. Yet, for every Sherman transferred to foreign service, several more faced the scrap dealer's torch. The systematic dismantling of surplus tanks accelerated through the late 1940s and early 1950s as steel demand for post-war reconstruction exceeded supply. Breaking a Sherman tank yielded roughly 30 tons of steel plate suitable for remelting. Non-ferrous metals proved even more valuable: copper wiring, brass fittings, bronze bushings. The tank's components separated by type commanded higher prices than the complete vehicle. British scrap operations proceeded on industrial scale. Photographs from the period showed dozens of Sherman and Stuart tanks piled atop each other, awaiting cutting torches. Workers systematically stripped valuable components first: radio equipment, optical sights, fire control systems, then attacking the hull with acetylene torches, reducing welded steel to manageable sections. These pieces, sorted by metal composition, went to steel mills hungry for raw material. A single facility might process 6 Sherman tanks simultaneously, employing hundreds of workers and what amounted to reverse manufacturing. American scrapyards followed similar patterns. Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Gulf Coast facilities received steady streams of condemned tanks through the late 1940s. The process was methodical: engines removed and stripped for parts, transmissions dismantled for gear steel, armor plate cut into sections and loaded onto rail cars bound for foundries. At peak periods between 1946 and 1950, American breakers dismantled hundreds of Sherman tanks weekly. Within 4 years, the visible surplus had largely vanished into the industrial supply chain. The environmental implications of this mass disposal remained unconsidered at the time. Scrapyards dumped unsuitable materials directly into harbors or onto adjacent land. Asbestos insulation, used extensively in Sherman tanks for fireproofing, was stripped and discarded without protection. Workers contracted asbestos-related diseases decades later. Oil and fuel residues contaminated soil. Paint containing lead and other toxic metals leached into groundwater. Modern environmental assessments of former scrap sites reveal significant heavy metal pollution requiring expensive remediation. The hidden cost of rapid disposal manifests today in industrial zones across both America and Europe. If you're finding this examination of post-war armored vehicle disposal interesting, consider subscribing for more documentaries exploring what happened to the weapons and equipment that shaped the modern world. Preservation was never entirely absent from consideration. As early as 1946, military historians and veterans organizations recognized that Sherman tanks represented significant industrial and military achievement deserving commemoration. The challenge lay in their sheer ordinariness. Unlike warships with distinguished combat records or aircraft associated with specific battles, Sherman tanks were utilitarian workhorses. Preserving one meant preserving a type, not a unique historical artifact. The first Sherman tanks preserved as monuments appeared in the late 1940s and early 1950s at American military bases and veterans' memorials. These were typically vehicles withdrawn from service and donated to communities with strong military connections. Paint schemes varied wildly. Some retained wartime markings, others received Korean War colors. Many bore completely ahistorical decoration chosen for visual appeal rather than authenticity. Museum acquisition proceeded slowly. The Tank Museum in Bovington in England obtained several Sherman variants through the late 1940s, recognizing their importance to British armored operations. The oldest surviving Sherman tank, an M4A1 with early production features, resides at Bovington. This tank, named Michael, was the first Sherman delivered to Britain under Lend-Lease and was displayed on Horse Guards Parade in London as a symbol of American industrial support. Their survival rate tells a sobering story. Of 49,324 Sherman tanks produced, current estimates suggest roughly 1,200 examples survive worldwide in some form. Many are incomplete hulks, missing engines, turrets, or other major components. Perhaps several hundred Sherman tanks remain in reasonably complete condition in museums and private collections. Only a handful maintain operational status, capable of movement under their own power. The Tank Museum in Bovington occasionally runs operational Shermans during demonstration events. Private collectors in the United States maintain several running Shermans for film work and historical reenactments. The movie Fury, filmed in 2014, featured operational Sherman tanks that had survived through military surplus sales, collector acquisition, and meticulous restoration. Each represents hundreds of thousands of dollars in restoration investment and ongoing maintenance costs. The contrast between wartime abundance and modern scarcity proves striking. In 1945, Sherman tanks crowded every available storage facility. Disposal presented logistical challenges. Military planners worried about the expense of maintaining vast surplus inventories. Today, a restored Sherman tank commands between $250,000 and $400,000 in the collector market. Museums compete for acquisition of even incomplete empals. The vehicles dismissed as obsolete and scrapped for pennies on the dollar now represent irreplaceable historical artifacts. The technological and operational lessons from Sherman tank development influenced Cold War armored vehicle design significantly. The emphasis on reliability over maximum performance, the benefits of standardized components enabling rapid production and field maintenance, the value of automotive industry involvement in military manufacturing. These principles shaped American tank development through the M26 Pershing, M46 Patton, and subsequent generations. The Sherman's post-war career also revealed the remarkable adaptability of competent basic design. Nations operating Shermans upgraded them repeatedly: better guns, improved engines, enhanced armor. The Israeli Super Sherman program demonstrated that thoughtful modernization could keep a 1940s tank competitive against 1960s Soviet designs. This influenced military procurement philosophy, suggesting that incremental upgrade of proven platforms might offer better value than complete replacement with new, untested designs. From a contemporary perspective, the rapid disappearance of Sherman tanks represents a remarkable example of how quickly even massive industrial achievements can be erased from the landscape. The 11 factories that produced 49,324 tanks between 1942 and 1945 had mostly ceased tank production by 1946. The Chrysler Detroit tank arsenal transitioned to automotive components. Ford's tank production facilities returned to civilian vehicle manufacturing. Pacific Car and Foundry, the only West Coast Sherman producer, shifted to heavy truck manufacturing and later became known as PACCAR, a major commercial vehicle manufacturer. The workers who built Sherman tanks, many of them women who entered industrial employment during wartime labor shortages, dispersed into peacetime economy. The specialized skills of tank assembly, armor welding, and turret fitting became obsolete. The vibrant working-class communities surrounding tank plants experienced economic disruption as employment plummeted from wartime peaks to peacetime minimums. Today, visitors can tour the few surviving Sherman tanks in museums from Bovington to New Orleans, from Israel to Australia. These machines, cramped and utilitarian, convey the industrial achievement they represent, but cannot fully capture the scale of production or the breadth of service. Standing before a Sherman tank, it becomes difficult to imagine 49,324 identical machines emerging from American factories in just over 3 years. The physical evidence has vanished too completely. The disposal of Sherman tanks established patterns repeated with subsequent military equipment surpluses. The tension between strategic reserve requirements and fiscal pressure to liquidate assets. The distribution of surplus equipment to allied nations as foreign policy tool. The environmental consequences of rapid industrial dismantling. The eventual scarcity of once ubiquitous equipment as scrap dealers and time eliminate physical evidence. What began in May 1945 as a logistical problem, what to do with nearly 50,000 surplus tanks, resolved through distribution, reactivation, and systematic elimination. By 1960, the vast majority had vanished, scrapped for steel, destroyed in subsequent conflicts, abandoned in remote locations where recovery proved economically impractical. The Sherman tank, America's most produced armored vehicle, exists today primarily in photographs, technical documentation, and the roughly 1,200 survivors scattered across museums and collections worldwide. The question posed in 1945, what does one do with 50,000 tanks when war ends, received its answer through economics, strategic calculation, and the relentless pressure to move forward rather than preserve the past. The scrap value prevailed over historical value for most vehicles. The strategic reserve concept saved some for Korea, but doomed others to storage that became permanent disposal. The foreign assistance programs armed dozens of nations while emptying American depots. Of the 49,324 Sherman tanks that rolled off assembly lines between 1942 and 1946, estimates suggest roughly 1,200 survive in some form today. The survival rate stands below 3%. These steel monuments to American industrial mobilization, mass-produced to defeat fascism, proved too ordinary to preserve broadly, too expensive to maintain indefinitely, too valuable as scrap steel to justify widespread storage. The machines that carried Allied armies to victory vanished with shocking completeness, leaving behind a documentary record far exceeding the physical evidence of their existence. Paraguay's last 3 Shermans, heavily modified and aging, stood down in April 2018, closing the final chapter on active service for a tank that had defined armored warfare for a generation. What remains are fragments, preserved machines in museums, fading photographs, and the memories of those who built them, crewed them, and watched them disappear.